Hi, Christ the King. How are you doing? How are you holding up? We're in our third week of social distancing, and our first week of a stay at home order from the governor. And I'm wondering how you're doing. Perhaps at this point you do know someone who's been diagnosed with COVID-19. Perhaps the anxiety that you have or the fear that you've been pushing down and trying not to show is oozing out at people you love. Perhaps you're doing okay, but you're feeling cooped up and missing your friends or your coworkers or the opportunity to be at school. Maybe you're just tired of doing everything on a screen and you long to actually be with people face to face again. I don't know about you, but for me, last week was easier. It was easier to feel hopeful, easier to see the helpers helping and feel inspired. Last week, I appreciated a little more time at home and the time I got to spend with Solomon and Nat. Last week, it felt new and novel and like there was some possibility in figuring out how we navigate this life together and how we get to be creative together in this time. But now, this time at home doesn't feel new anymore. Now we still don't have routines and we still don't have a schedule, and our whole life just starts to feel out of whack. And even now, I'm hearing more and more messages out there to stay positive. And although I appreciate them, and I think they're really important, it is important to stay positive, I'm feeling kind of alone in the real devastation of this experience and of what's happening in our world and in our community. I'm wondering if anyone else is feeling that way. This week, I'm really resonating with Ezekiel as he sits in the valley of the dry bones. And God comes to him and says, Ezekiel, can these bones live? Ezekiel looks around and sees all these bones, and they're so dry. There is no sign of life to be found anywhere. So he honestly looks at God and says, I don't know. You tell me, God. I'm feeling similar this week to Mary and Martha, who are sad and grieving and confused as to why Jesus took so long to come, when they say to Jesus, Jesus, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. One of the spiritual practices that we have as a resource to us in times like these is the practice of lament. The practice of expressing our grief and our sorrow to God. Lament, contrary to what some people might say, is actually a very faithful practice, and we find it all over our scriptures. There's a whole book in the Old Testament called Lamentations. About a third of the Psalms are laments. I think we hear Ezekiel lamenting in the reading from this morning and his story and experience of the valley of the dry bones. And I think we hear Mary and Martha lament as they respond to Jesus. Sometimes when life as we know it seems to be slipping through our fingers and the things that used to be familiar and fun and the things that we loved seem to no longer be possible, like going to school or going to work or going to the grocery store without being afraid of all of the other people who are there and if they might be carriers of COVID-19, or if I myself am a carrier of COVID-19 and I'm going to give it to others. Sometimes when we're in the midst of that, we need to let ourselves lament. Because if we move too quickly to look on the bright side or to stay positive, we deny ourselves the ability to really feel those difficult feelings, and they will likely catch up with us anyway. So I want to invite us to look at our reading again and to notice that we see Jesus doing this. He thinks, it's okay, I've got time. I'll go see Lazarus in a few days. But then, upon seeing Mary and Martha, he asks them to stay positive. Don't you believe what God can do? Don't you believe in the resurrection that I've been preaching? And yet, when the gravity of Lazarus' death sinks in, when he really allows himself to feel it, even Jesus, even the person who is God, who knows more deeply and intimately than any of us what God is capable of doing. Even he cannot hide his raw emotions. Even Jesus is deeply, deeply moved. Even Jesus weeps. Dr. Brene Brown says that the two most powerful words when we're in struggle are me too. This, I believe, is the good news for us today. God knew that the only way to fully understand, to fully show God's love to us, was through entering into our experience, the whole of it, not just the nice and the fun and the wonderful, joyful experiences of our lives, but the difficult, the alienating, the lonely, the sad. So God became human to teach us what it looks like to love each other, to care for one another, but to also be able to say, me too. God feels the challenges of this time with us. God grieves with you when you are unable to be with your family members who live in care facilities. God grieves with you when somebody that you love has passed away and you're not able to celebrate their lives with a funeral in the way that we would have otherwise. God grieves with you when you struggle to manage your anxiety or your fear and you're tempted to hoard things. God grieves with you when you wonder what this will mean for our future. When you are wondering how long you'll be able to keep your job. When you're wondering what you're going to do because you've lost your job and your source of income. God grieves with you. These are real things to grieve. They are real worries, and you are not alone in them. Laments usually take on a specific form. So once someone has turned to God, they then express their grief to God, and they ask for help. God, help me. And then they proclaim the trust that they know that God is capable of doing far more than we ask or imagine. They proclaim that they do not have to be alone, that God is present with them, that God can do so many things. Because why would we even express our grief to God if we didn't have the smallest ounce of faith that God is there? After Jesus allows himself to be deeply moved from that place of deep sadness and grief, Jesus goes to the tomb where Lazarus has been put to rest. And he, too, proclaims his trust in God's grace. Father, I thank you for having heard me, for I know that you always hear me, he says. And after he says these things is when he shouts with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! And Lazarus comes out of the tomb wrapped still in all of his cloth. Unbind him and let him go, he asks those who are around, those who are baffled and amazed at what they've seen, at what God is capable of doing. So perhaps you are somebody who feels strength and hope and encouragement right now. And to you, I want you to hear this. Thanks be to God. It is wonderful. I am glad. And I hope that you can share some of that hope and encouragement with others. But I also want you to hear this, to hear what I have to say to those of us who are not in that place. So if you are somebody who's struggling to find hope right now, if you are somebody who's grieving, who's sad, who needs to be in those feelings for a little bit, I want you to know this. Me too. The good news for you and for me today is that God is here with us. We are not alone. You are not alone. And you don't need to skip the lament. You don't need to skip past those difficult feelings. For it is through going through them, through being in them, that we know that God can follow through with God's trusts in what is possible. Make your requests known to God. Share your difficult feelings with those that you love and trust. You will feel positive again someday, but it's okay that you don't right now. To all of us, I want to say this. Wherever you are right now is okay. It is exactly where you need to be, and you are not alone there. Thanks be to God. Amen.